This is a revision video on writing the 25 mark essay, which is at the end of your context question on your Economics AS level with AQA. This is a video that quite a few of you have asked me to make, but I figured that before I started I'd just go through answering the other questions really quickly. The first question is always a definition. Make sure you're up to date on definitions, you know all of them off by heart when you go into the exam, and when you get into the exam just write it down really quickly. 2 sentences should be enough. Remember, if they ask you something like the current account, write down all the components of the current account, don't forget anything. Second question is always a comparison. Use the data, quote the data, probably quote at least 2 pieces of data in each of your significant features. Write differences between the data, do calculations yourself. Make sure you include the unit, otherwise you can lose a mark very easily there. Third question tends to differ between micro and macro. In micro it always says, draw a diagram and use the information in one of the extracts. If it says draw a diagram, check your diagram's correct, there's quite a few marks for this. And quote from the text. Make sure you explain all your points thoroughly. For example, if you're writing about how an ageing population caused there to be an increase in demand for NHS services, write, there are older people tend to be more likely to succumb to diseases, they're more likely to have serious injuries, if they fall over they're more likely to have a bone fracture, and thus they demand the services. Don't just say, more elderly people means a greater demand on the services, because that's what they've already told you. Write why it means that, and then show the effect of that on the diagram. If you're writing, changing lifestyles have caused there to be an increase in demand, what changing lifestyles? Write down all of your points, make sure you link them. There's marks for linking, so make sure all of your points are linked. And always reference back to your diagram, that's really important. With macroeconomics, they tend to ask you to explain 2 factors. For example, in June 2013, Context 2, Question 3 asked you to explain 2 factors other than a fall in the value of the pound. So whatever you do, don't write about exchange rates and stuff like that, which might help you to reduce the size of the deficit on the current account of the UK balance payments. If you chose one of your factors to be investment, you might say an increased investment, and then you say what into, so into capital equipment and labour. What would that lead to? An increase in factor productivity, and then you'd write what that meant, so it's more is being produced per factor of production per period of time. Then you'd write that it caused average cost to fall. You have to keep making links, and you just keep going to why this would mean that goods were cheaper on the international market, so demand in other countries would rise, and that would lead to an increase in UK exportation. And then you might also want to add that if goods are being produced that are cheaper in the UK, that means that UK consumers might want to choose UK produced goods and services over other goods and services from abroad, imports, and thus they would reduce their importation. And then you do a wrap-up statement saying that the increase in exports and decrease in imports would lead to a reduction of the deficit on the current account. And then you go on and do exactly the same for your second point. So it's just about making the links here. Moving on now to the joys of the 25 marker. Try to leave as long as possible to write this question. When you're quite fast at multiple choice, you should be able to do them in about 5-10 minutes and do all the rest of the other questions in 10 to 15 minutes. And that should leave you, about 45 minutes or more maybe to write your final essay. And obviously, because it's worth 1/3 of all the marks, you need to spend as much time as possible getting all of your marks down. Obviously, don't sacrifice the earlier marks, which are really easy to get to write this 25 marker. But make sure you can get a decent amount of time just so you can get everything down, because there's so much you can write down for these questions, particularly for macroeconomics. In your introduction, you'll just define any key terms in the question and keep it very short and simple. For example, in June 2010, the question 4 was about various policies that could be used to help an economy such as the UK recover from a recession. So you define recession within your introduction. A recession occurs when the economy is growing at less than its long-term rate of growth, and often occurs in a negative output gap. You might do a diagram showing a negative output gap, and then you'd say in a negative output gap the economy is producing less than its trend output, and thus its GDP is below its productive potential. You need to do too much more than that. Basically, just define key terms and gently ease the reader into your essay. Make it powerful and make sure it's correct, because this is the examiner's first proper opinion of you. They're going to form an idea of how well you're going to do from this introduction. Make it powerful. There are typically 2 different types of questions they can ask you in microeconomics and macroeconomics. I've looked through a lot of past papers, and the trend for microeconomics is to either ask you about how a government could intervene in a market. So it might say, the food market is failing, how could the government, save it or help the market to come back to normal. Or it could say, there's a system in place, buffer stocks is the big one for this, and assess the pros and cons of using buffer stocks. And then for macroeconomics, it's either going to be policies or the impact of something happening. So it might say inflation rate rises in the UK, assess the impact this is going to have on the economy. Actually, they probably wouldn't do that because inflation is one of the factors. I suppose they could do. They might do increase in productivity, decrease in importation, that sort of thing. And then macroeconomics, another one they could do is government intervention is necessary. So they might say, there's high inflation, what can the government do to help to reduce this? And you'd have to go through all the different policies and say what you think about them. But in your second paragraph for each, for your government intervention in the market macroeconomics, you'll explain the situation, and in that you'll describe why market failure has occurred. For example, in January 2013, question 4 was assessing which is the best policy that the UK government could adopt to reduce congestion on the roads. And in your second paragraph, after your introduction, what you're going to be writing about is why market failure has occurred, so why congestion is a form of market failure, and thus why the government needs to correct it. Your second macroeconomic one would be issues with an intervention, for example, buffer stocks. So in your second paragraph, you're going to write about how buffer stocks should work. You'll probably have your diagram there, and you'll write about, the positives of using it and why you should be using it, and how it should work in practice, and then you'll go on in later paragraphs to write about how it actually works. With macroeconomics, you'll have the effect of a change in the market. There's not too much you can say about this. You can go into a bit of detail about it. And for example, for the one about the current account deficit, reducing it, my second paragraph was very short. It literally just said, should the UK government attempt to rebalance the economy through export-led growth and a reduction in the imports of goods and services, quote there, quoting is very important, from abroad, there will be many consequences for all aspects of the economy. And then I went on later paragraphs to do the stuff we're going to talk about on the next slide. The final macroeconomic one is explaining why a situation is undesirable such that government policy is needed. For example, June 2010 context 2, policies to help an economy recover from a recession. You might put, being in a recession would be deemed generally undesirable by economies. Having a reduced output means there's a reduced demand for labour, and thus many people are made cyclically unemployed, and a negative multiplier effect. Not only does this mean that labour is also lost, which can never be recovered, but also ruins the risk of discouraged workers who never return to the labour market, even after the economy returns to a positive output gap, in which they would be easily able to gain a job. This could be deemed to be a drain on government resources, as those discouraged workers will not be contributing to income tax contributions, they will not be earning, and they will instead be claiming welfare payments, running the risk of plunging the government further into a budget deficit. The opportunity cost of the government paying out mass welfare payments, for example in the form of job seekers' allowance, could be the sacrifice of the UK's high educational standards, thus reducing the productivity of tomorrow's workforce. This reduction in productivity could have many costs for the UK, such as reducing its international competitiveness, and thus forcing it deeper into a current account deficit and an undesirable situation for any economy, as it will lead to great withdrawals from the circular flow of income, and thus the level of national income will fall, leading to a reduction in aggregate demand, which could essentially deepen the level of recession such that it becomes an economic slump. I mean, I'm not saying that's a perfect answer, probably isn't, it's probably a bit too much there, but second paragraph you really want to be writing about why the government needs to use policies to reduce the impact of the situation. So if they've given you a situation and they want you to look at lots of different policies, your second paragraph wants to be focused on why they want to use these policies, why the situation is undesirable, stuff like that. Now we're on to the bulk of the essay, so this is all of the paragraphs between the second paragraph and the conclusion. If there's government intervention in the market and they've asked you to discuss various intervention types, you're going to explain each intervention type, how it should work, and then you're going to go on to explain the issues of each intervention type. You'll probably be able to do 3 or 4 intervention types if you can think of that many, because it's microeconomics, so there's not as many policies as macroeconomics. And then you're going, well, I suppose for macroeconomics there's only 3 big ones, but microeconomics, for each situation there are fewer policies, I'd say. And then you're going to explain the issue with interventions, talk about government failure a lot, they love that. You go from market failure, government trying to resolve it, and then having government failure. So you'll probably do, a paragraph about the intervention and how it should work, and then a paragraph about how it might not work, possible disadvantages of using it, stuff like that. If you can use a diagram and you can draw it pretty quickly, draw it, because they love that too. Then we've got the issues of intervention. So if you've got a benefit and a cost of intervention, they basically ask you to do the pros and cons of the government intervening in a market. What you'll do is you'll do the benefits of the intervention. You'll find quite a few. If you can try to analyse them as you go along, so you might say, well, using buffer stocks leads to and increase in exportation as there may be excess of buffer stock stored, which we can sell to third world countries. And then you'll say, however, if we sell them to third world countries, this could lead to poverty in third world countries for the farmers who are going to be, outpriced, forced out of the market by these cheap imports into the country. So do some analysis and evaluation as you go along. And then we come on to the joys of macroeconomics. I think for macroeconomics it's so much easier to know what to write, because for the effect of changing the economy, you look at the effect on all the government objectives. So you look at it on economic growth, employment and unemployment, inflation, price stability, and the balance payments. So it's 4 very simple things, that's what you've got to look at. Obviously, you've got to do them in a whole wealth of detail, quote the data continually, anything they give you in the data, make sure they use it, particularly the third extract is usually the one to look at for your big hints. Aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagrams are always really useful, so use them as much as you can, if you've got the time to draw them and stuff. Your second macroeconomic one is when the government intervention is necessary, so you'll simply go through each policy, explain each policy, and explain, how it should work, what the issues of using each one are. So you'll do fiscal, monetary and supply side. Remember, fiscal you've got demand side, supply side. Monetary policy you've got your money supply, interest rates and out-of-stick exchange rates in there as well, next to interest rates probably, and then you've got your actual supply side policies. So you'll just go through those. There is so much you can write on it, don't even underestimate how much you could write on it potentially. I was doing one yesterday, probably in a lot more detail than I should have been doing it in, and all the essential paragraphs for just one essay were 2,500 words, so you can just keep going. So it's important to understand that you haven't got time to write everything in, to keep the detail. So you've got the detail there, but you've got all of your policies in, so you might have to restrict the amount of points you make about each policy simply to ensure you get them all in a significant level of detail. By the way, that wasn't done in the 2,500, that was just me trying to do a bit of revision whilst trying to answer a past paper question. So you go through your policy, how it should work and how it might actually work. So say you're talking about interest rates and you want to reduce aggregate demand in the economy because you want to reduce inflation. You'll put up your interest rates, but then you'll say, if we put up our interest rates, that will strengthen the pound and thus worsen our balance payments deficit. And then you'd say the costs of doing this. You'd probably make a better connection between the interest rates and the strength of the pound. You'd probably describe how a change in interest rates causes a change in the strength of the exchange rate and stuff like that. Just make sure you get all of your links in. Then you come on to the joys of conclusion. Make sure you get a conclusion in there. In the mock I felt that I was running out of time and I might not have time to write as many paragraphs as I wanted to write. I always write too much, don't worry about that. So I left a few paragraphs, wrote my conclusion, then went back and did the other paragraphs. I actually had time to do them anyway. But it's important to get a conclusion in because that's worth 5 marks. You can't get onto the top band for the marking if you don't have a conclusion. It's got to be a detailed conclusion as well. So that's where a lot of people struggle to pick up marks. If you just look at the mark scheme, you'll see the importance of having a good conclusion. You can drop so many marks without a conclusion. And now we can look at what actually you want to put in a conclusion. So for the microeconomics, government intervention in markets, in your conclusion, you'll discuss the pros and cons of the intervention. You'll obviously have done this already, but you'll discuss what it would have been like without and what it would be like with, and then you yourself have to come to a conclusion about whether you should intervene or not, and the best method of intervention. You'll have to write why you believe in this and why you believe that the other option or options aren't suitable. Try to make your conclusion quite strong and long. Then microeconomics, if you've got a certain type of intervention like buffer stocks, you'll come to a conclusion. You'll say, the costs of using buffer stocks outweigh the positives. They're not very practical in reality they don't really tend to work, that's what I meant. Stuff like that, and in your conclusion you'll write all about that. You'll add a few details as well, references to earlier on in your essay, and make sure you've put your own opinion in, so whether you think that they'll work or not, that sort of thing. Again, try to go into quite a lot of detail in your conclusion, make it a strong conclusion. Macroeconomics. In your conclusion you essentially want to sum up the effect on each government objective and give a sort of final conclusion, final statement. Make sure you give a sort of criticism of your points as you're going along. So you might say, in theory, the situation might lead to this happening, but the reality is that due to certain issues, this may not be the case. and then you would wrap it up with the final sentence. So, for example, for the June 2013 Context 2 question, significant increase in exports and reduction in imports of goods and services, my wrapping up ending was, however, in the long term, an increase in demand for UK goods and services domestically and internationally, accompanied by an increase in UK productive capacity, would lead to falling unemployment and a desirable economic situation for the UK. Although it may take time, there is substantial evidence that the UK economy could benefit greatly from export-led growth. That's just the last two sentences of the conclusion. There's another... how many words? Let's have a look. Another, just over 100 words in that conclusion. There's also a diagram that goes with it. So get as much as you can to a conclusion, pack it with evidence and ideas, because that's what the examiners love, they'll lap it up. Your other macroeconomic question could be about government intervention being necessary. In your conclusion, you're going to want to conclude which policy is the most effective. An example here are policies in reducing a recession or reducing the impact of recession, stuff like that. In conclusion, whilst all three policies clearly work well in the hypothetical market, the reality shows that the effects of the supply-side policy are severely limited, and thus it seems that it would be far more economically viable to implement a different policy. Although the expansionary fiscal policy increases aggregate demand fairly quickly, its severe impact on the budget of a government means it is not ideal when long-term and sizable increases of aggregate demand are necessary. For this reason, a government wishing to recover from a recession may wish to consider the expansionary monetary policy to be its most valid option, as it not only prevents a prolonged recession, but also helps stimulate the economy to be more competitive in the international market through its effect on an economy's exchange rate. It also encourages investment, meaning that it increases the economy's long-term productive ability, an important feature of an economy which wishes to compete following a recession in the rapidly developing economic world. Obviously, that's just one example. You might want to do a conclusion differently. You might choose a different policy. Do the policy, not necessarily the one that you believe in, but the one that you think you can best explain and argue for. I mean, in my conclusion, I tried to give a positive of each policy where I could. I mean, supply side's it's pretty rubbish, to be honest. And then you've got to give a negative. So the ones that you're discarding, you're going to want to say why you're discarding them and why you've chosen your final policy. And that brings us to the end of the How to Write a 25 Marker Economics Essay video. Woo! Hopefully it wasn't too long-winded and you got the general idea. And that is my last ever Economics AS revision video. Yay, you don't have to listen to my annoying voice anymore. Woo, lucky you. I'm not really sure how I'm going to revise now, because making these videos has been my primary form of revision, but guess I'll have to survive somehow. Best of luck in the exam. I'm sure you'll do fabulously, even though I've got no idea who you are, if anyone's even watching this or gets to the end of this video. Chances of that happening are probably highly unlikely. But anyway, have a lovely day. Goodbye.